Hey everybody, I'm back. Today we're going to be covering chapter 23, population, urbanization, and the environment. Now, here's a sign the apocalypse is near. This environment used to be a separate chapter, but I guess about 6 editions ago they combined it all in one because once again we got the environment covered. We don't have to worry too much about that. Okay. Start off with a quote here by Anonymous. Children are poor men's riches. And if you have children, you won't be rich long if you're in a post-industrial society. But anyway, we'll talk about that more in a moment. Okay. Hey, we now have well over 7 billion people, and the population continues to grow. Demography is the study of human population. Uh, as you go through this beginning part of this chapter, you will see terms like migration, immigration, emigration, mortality, and fertility, which are all ways of either entering the human population box or leaving it, like emigration and mortality would be ways of leaving the population box. So demography considers population to be a system within boundaries. In terms of fertility, the incidence of childbearing in a country is one way, of course, to enter the population square. Fertility in the US has declined despite rising tax deductions for children. Once again, it's very difficult to enact policies that cause people to have more children. We talked about this under welfare. People say, oh, these welfare mothers all doing is popping out more kids because they'll get more money. It doesn't work that way. You get much more from tax credits from the federal government. And even that hasn't increased population growth or birth rates, I should say. In fact, last year, this year, we have hit the lowest population rate in, I think, 3 or 4 decades. Let's see. Hitting the highlights here. I know you're busy. You will see on figure 23-1, 23-2 has the age sex pyramid for the United States and Mexico. An imbalance in the sex ratio tends to give the less numerous category more relative power. Historically, men outnumbered women in the western states of the US, so women had more power in the West than did women in the East. This contributed to the fact that many of the first women to gain state and national political office were from Western states. And now, with women being the majority of the population in the United States, changes things dramatically. For example, in the most recent election, I'll go back to 2018. From 2018 on, a lot more women have been elected to legislatures. Some of that changed a little bit in 2020 because of the dynamics of the election. But as women have, being the majority of the population, you see it evidenced in so many ways in terms of women's ability to achieve different things in our society. Excuse me. Economic development shapes a nation's population pyramid. India has 4 times the United States population, but we have more people aged 80 and over. Although the US has 2 times the population of Nigeria, that nation has more children aged 5 and under. Are you ready for a quiz? It's always one of my favorite quizzes. Half the world's people, I blame it on the pandemic. Half of the world's people live in 6 nations. What are they? I'll theme from Jeopardy in honor of Alex Trebek, the late Alex Trebek, the late great Alex Trebek. Da, 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 da. What's the question, Maynard? Half the world's people live in 6 nations. What are they? Dun, 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 dun. What could they be? Okay, now in class, here's how it usually goes. After a while, people get China, India, and the United States. That is 3. China, India, and the United States. It's the rest that are hard to get. And so in the past, students will say, Africa. And I go, no, that's a continent. Would you like to buy a vowel? Or they'll go, Europe. No, 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 no. See, once again, that's a continent. That's not a country. Anyway, the others are, it's China, India, the United States, Indonesia, Brazil, and Pakistan. Here's an answer to another trivia question. Where is the world's largest number of Muslims? And it's Indonesia. Fascinating, Maynard. I know. Okay. Global Map 23-1 depicts that population is rising fastest in continents like Africa. Again, it's a continent that can least afford to support more people. The median age of the world's people. Okay, what's the median? The median is the one right in the middle. Rank them highest to lowest, median's in the middle. The median age of the world's population is 26 years old. 33% are under 14, 20% are over 44 years of age. The United Nations estimates that global population will begin to stabilize at about 9.7 billion by the year 2050. In the text, Malthusian, Thomas Malthus theory is described, where he argued that food supply increases arithmetically, but the population increases geometrically. So his theory was that population will eventually outstrip the food supply. Now this concern is not unlike in the 1970s and 1980s. There was a book written by Paul and Ann Ehrlich called The Population Bomb. And they were really concerned about the Earth's overpopulation, and we need to do something immediately. And effectively, it already is happening, because in the industrial and post-industrial societies, the birth rate's dropping dramatically, so we're not replicating the population anymore. And even in the poorest nations of the world, birth rates are beginning to come under much more control. So Malthus' argument about the food supply increases arithmetically, the population increases geometrically, is a conservative argument that ignores economic distribution and instead focuses on the inability to produce enough food. Karl Marx, you remember him, social conflict point of view, argues the radical position, saying that it's not production that's the problem, but lies with the inadequacy of the distribution of food, that the rich hoard more than they need and the rest suffer. Well, again, there's truth to that, because we currently produce enough food to feed everybody in the planet 1.5 times, yet some 600 million people are suffering from chronic hunger and or starving to death. Well, for the exam, you need to know about demographic transition theory. It begins on page 609. It's pretty easy to understand, I hope. And there's even a graph there that kind of explains it. But anyway, I will explain it for you. It's the thesis that population patterns are linked to a society's level of technological development. Technology, Lenski, technology, Lenski. Remember, with technology, that's why we moved from hunting and gathering societies to horticultural and pastoral to agricultural to industrial to post-industrial. So as the type of technology improved or increased, or the level of technology increased, it led to a new phase in sociocultural evolution and increased population growth. Okay, it's actually part of modernization theory, which we discussed in chapter 12. Modernization theory was the structural functional, the conservative approach to how do we account for poverty in the world? All right, demographic transition theory begins with stage one, typical of pre-industrial agrarian societies. Here the birth rates are high. Children are a valuable source of labor. So this gets back to the original quote as we began this chapter, children are poor man's riches. Well, why? Because they're a valuable source of labor. There's no effective birth control. Death rates are high. Now, again, the other reason why children are a poor man's riches, not just because they bring income, food, whatever, into the household, but also in some of the poorest nations of the world, you could have 6 kids and only 2 live to be adults because of the high death rate of children. Okay, in stage one, there's a low standard of living. There's an absence of advanced medical technology. Mortality rates tend to fluctuate. So as a result, population increase is very gradual, as it had been for thousands of years prior to the Industrial Revolution, which was when? (1750). That's correct. Thank you. Thank you very much over there. 1750, which is also the beginning of modern times, the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And the Industrial Revolution began in Europe around 1750. Stage two of demographic transition theory, beginnings of industrialization. Here the birth rates are high, but death rates fall sharply. Why? Because technology expands the food supply and technology advances medicine and consequent control of disease. Most of the middle and low income countries are currently in this stage. Let me give you an example. Kenya. Yes, I can. Kenya has a population about the same as California, but Kenya once had a 4% annual increase in population, which, if it had gone unchecked, would have resulted in population of about 250 million by the year 2050. With a current growth rate of 2.4% annually, Nigeria's population of 135 million will reach 280 million by 2034. 50% of the population there is under 24 years of age. The population rate dropped there from, birth rate rather, dropped from 6.7 births per woman to a current 2.1. And you got to feel bad for that 0.1 kid. Probably a few fries short of a Happy Meal. Stage three, fully developed industrial societies. Here the birth rates fall, but they're variable. There's a higher standard of living, which means kids are more expensive to raise. So from an economic asset, as they are in poor societies of the world, they become an economic liability and will only grow up to disappoint you. Also, women work outside the home. In fact, one key predictor of fertility is women's income. As wages and salaries rise, fertility falls and vice versa. So in other words, as countries move into the industrial phase, women are working more, they have career opportunities, they're working more. And as women work outside the home, it has a natural consequence of reducing the birth rate. In fully developed industrial societies, there's effective means and use of birth control, and there are lower death rates. There's also highly developed and available medical technologies. So if you put all these factors together, population growth is slow. Abortion in the, post-industrial society is stage 4, which is where we're at right now. The demographic transition theory is now complete. Birth rates keep falling. Why? Because dual income families become the norm and the cost of raising children continues to rise. Abortion in the US contributes to this too. It's now under 1 million pregnancies are aborted each year. There are steady death rates and the population grows only very slowly or even decreases. So Japan, Europe, and the United States are all in this stage 4. Let's see. Now, you may recall I argued that a key point for the United States is immigration. So if we have millions of immigrants coming in here, it offsets the population uh, decrease, actually, because we're not replicating ourselves anymore as of the last couple of decades. So in terms of the impact on the economy, which is once again 70% based on consumer spending, having immigrants here offsets the big crises that all the European countries and Japan have been facing as their population continues to age out and they can't replicate it. United Nations predicts that by 2100, rich societies will fall by 20% in their population, while poor societies will rise 50%. Let's see here. China has a legal minimum age of marriage, 22 years for men and 20 for women. In some cities, such as Beijing, the ages are even higher, 28 years for men and 25 for women. Again, as a means of controlling population. Critical evaluation of demographic transition theory. This theory embraces modernization theory's emphasis on the ability of technological developments to check population growth at manageable levels, and that we will always have increasing resources. The key then is industrialization of poor societies to slow population growth and increase standard of living, which is the trend around the world. However, minus significant redistribution of resources, the world will become increasingly divided into industrialized halves, typically in the northern hemisphere of the globe, with low population growth, and non-industrialized have-nots on the southern hemisphere of the globe, struggling to feed their soaring populations. Urbanization, the growth of cities. Urbanization is the concentration of population in cities. Again, around 1900 is when we crossed the threshold of when we had a larger urban population than rural population here in the United States. I'll give you two contrasting points of view. Aristotle said, are we going to get another one of your impersonations from Aristotle? Sure, why not? Aristotle said, people come together in the city to live. They remain there in order to live the good life. He liked the cities. Thomas Jefferson, not a fan. He said, I view great cities as pestilential to the morals, the health, and the liberties of man. You recall that Thomas Jefferson envisioned an agricultural, how can I put it, paradise here in America, and just envision how the population become increasingly urbanized. Okay, you need to know, it's on page 612, the growth of U.S. cities. A key point is that currently 80% of the population lives in cities that cover only 1/6 of the land area. Check out table 23-1. In 1790, only 5% of the population lived in urban areas, which would lead to Jefferson's observation. By the time of the Civil War, that was between North and the South, blue-gray, Civil War here in the United States, fought over slavery. That was in 1860. There were 33% of the population lived in cities. Oh, let's see. So in terms of some of the developments that have happened, from 1950 on, we have urban decentralization and the flight to the suburbs. So this becomes possible after World War II. People have more money, prosperity after World War II. Instead of just spending on armaments, all that can now be devoted to the country. So GIs come back from the war, they have cash available to them to get houses. And so what happens? Well, people want to have houses where they can raise kids. And if you look at typical inner city homes, they're rather small and they have little to no yard. And so, but if I can move out in the suburbs, I have the big yard for the kids, the white picket fence and so forth. So this is the rise of suburbia in 1950s and all those sitcoms like Ozzie and Harriet and Leave It to Beaver and Father Knows Best. Today you watch shows like The Simpsons and it's like Father Knows Nothing. Anyway, or The Family Guy is another great example of Father Knows Nothing. Anyhow, so what does this mean? Well, who moves out of the city? Well, it's white people. And when they move out of the city, their money moves with them. So it's not only the flight of white people, it's the flight of white money. Why do the minorities not move out? Because they can't afford to move out of the city. So as a result, the cities become increasingly concentrated with minorities, and they become increasingly poorer, the cities themselves. So then you begin to see, starting in the 1960s and 1970s, the decline of the inner cities. So people no longer, well, why has this happened? Because what happens is when people move out to the burbs, outside the central city, you notice every major city in the United States has a beltway circulating around it. Well, then along that beltway is what develops, they're called edge cities. And so edge cities like are cities unto themselves that surround the larger city at which the beltway surrounds. But people don't have to go into the inner city anymore. They have to go into the city to work. Many of them, they can work along the perimeter of the edge cities. So schools, shopping needs, jobs are all available along the beltway. They don't have to go to the inner city. Now, that's certainly not to say that in any major city, what's the rush hour, everybody rushing in. What's the rush hour at night, everybody rushing out. So it doesn't mean there still aren't jobs in the city. It's just they're not as proliferate as they once were. So what this means is it erodes the tax base of the cities because all these people move out. And so the people who stay are in homes that are now cheaper. And so they're taxed, they get less tax return from it. And if businesses move out of the city, out into the burbs, that means a loss of revenue there for taxes. So the cities begin to go in dramatic decline, as you've seen in all the major northeastern cities. Then we have the geographical growth of the Sun Belt, the South and the West. Part of this is driven by retirement. People want to move to Florida. Older people want to move to and can afford to move to Florida, move to places like California, Arizona, and so forth. A lot of the movement to the South during this time, 50s, the 60s, and the 70s, was because there were no unions in the South. So a lot of corporations like Mack Truck moved plants down to places like South Carolina because they weren't unionized. Ironically, because of Mack Truck moving down to South Carolina, the whole state eventually became unionized, or at least unions were proliferate in the state. And so it drove up incomes, which eventually shut down the Mack Truck plant in South Carolina. So we then have the development of what are called megalopolises. And megalopolises are, well, for one thing, if you were in an airplane and you flew from Boston to Richmond, you would see it would seem like one continuous city. Megalopolises also include, for example, Monroe County in Pennsylvania, because there's so many people there who commute to New York City to work. It's considered part of New York City's standard metropolitan statistical area for demographic purposes. Okay, 1/3 of the US people live in central cities, 55% live in suburban areas, and the rest are rural residents. Also, 92% of apartment renters are couples and singles without kids, 44% are one-person households. The more recent development in the last 30 or 40 years is you're now starting to see people with money, particularly young people graduated from college, have money, have jobs, starting to move back into some of the renovated inner city neighborhoods, the process called gentrification, whereas they move back, it drives poor people out of having a place to live. Okay. In terms of urbanization in the poor nations, um, there's been a declining death rate in poor nations of the world due to improved technology, which of course equals a population explosion. Also, people migrate to the cities in search of a higher standard of living. They look for healthcare, electricity, running water, jobs, and schools. And all this overwhelms these cities and the poor nations of the world because they don't have the infrastructure, the water systems, the sewage systems to accommodate the people that are currently there, let alone this increase in population. So cities do offer more opportunities in the poor nations of the world, but they are now overwhelmed. Somebody I know was telling me that Mexico, we worry about traffic jams. They're far worse in other parts of the world because then also the streets weren't designed to accommodate this level of traffic. So a person I know has to go to Mexico City from time to time. And when he lands at the airport, he has to cross Mexico City to get to where he needs to go for his business purposes. And he said sometimes it will take an entire day just to get across the Mexico City area in terms of the horrendous traffic. The population growth of cities is typical of demographic transition theory stage 2, which I know you remember was high population growth in the early stages of industrialization. For example, okay, quiz question. Which was the first city in the world to reach 2 million in population? Yes, London. London. In 1840, London reached 2 million people. By 1900, only 4 cities had 2 million people. That included Berlin, Paris, and New York City. By 1985, there were 85 cities with 2 million or more people. Now there are 225 cities over 2 million people. Notice the trend. That's pretty amazing in that short period of time. Um, there are also 50 cities over 5 million people, 32 of which are in low income countries. So if you put these factors together, exploding population leads to less food, more demand for healthcare, fewer jobs, which results in poverty, which always results in environmental degradation too. Because when people are broke, they start stripping the natural resources in order to survive, which results in massive human suffering. Let's move on to the environment. Maybe there'll be some good news there. E.B. White said, I am pessimistic about the human race because it is too ingenious for its own good. Our approach to nature is to beat it into submission. We would stand a better chance of survival if we accommodated ourselves to this planet and viewed it appreciatively instead of skeptically and dictatorially. Rachel Carson. Rachel Carson, you may or may not know, wrote a seminal book called Silent Spring. What she was doing first of all, she was a female biologist. And at the time, because she was a female biologist, much of her work was immediately discredited. After all, she's a woman. What would she know about science? Literally, I'm not kidding you. So it was widely discredited. And what she did was she noticed the decreasing number of songbirds in the United States. And so she investigated as to why this was. And it was from the use of DDT. And you can actually watch videos of the 50s where they would just be massively spraying crops. And so, I mean, people would be standing right there, playing them down, just dust the crops with DDT, which we find out later, of course, is incredibly carcinogenic, but it was to the birds as well. So when birds would ingest insects that were sprayed with it, because whenever you spray an insecticide like that, it doesn't kill all the bugs. Then what happens is some of the bugs develop an immunity to it, the ones who survived or more of an immunity. So then you need more DDT to get more. But the other effect it had is when birds ate the bugs, it caused them to ingest the DDT, which caused their eggs to hatch prematurely. As a result, they weren't reproducing the number of songbirds. And what do songbirds eat? the very insects that affect the crops. So by spraying DDT, we reduced the natural predator of the bugs and instead added a carcinogenic to the soil. So the producers of those chemicals at the time vehemently argued against Rachel Carson, saying she didn't know what she was talking about and blah, blah, blah. Nevertheless, she wrote a book called Silent Spring, if you get the drift and the meaning of the title. In 1962, it was published, and it really changed everything. It did result in the ban of DDT, and it began to again elevate another woman to or elevate the perception of women as scientists. You would have thought Madame Curie would have been enough to do that, but apparently not. Anyway, in Silent Spring, she said, the control of nature is a phrase conceived of arrogance, born of the Neanderthal age of biology and philosophy, when it was supposed that nature exists for the convenience of man. I saw this on a bumper sticker. It said, we all live downwind. Albert Schweitzer said, man has lost the capacity to foresee and to forestall. He will end by destroying the earth. Now, Texas has a pesticide review board. And so on it, citizens or whoever are appointed to this board. And the idea is whenever a new chemical is introduced for sale, they review it first to make sure it's safe. Now, just so you know, the way this works with the Drug Administration is Federal Drug Administration. There is no way they can review all the drugs or all the pesticides and fungicides and herbicides for the release for the market. So what they do is they have a rule where the burden of proof is on the producer of the chemicals to make sure that it's okay. And so they'll run tests and say it's okay. And so until the FDA reviews it, which could take years, they're allowed to sell the chemical. I say this because so many times later, you have to question whether or not this is reliable research, because after all, they're trying to sell the chemical. And I'll give you a great example, is Roundup. Roundup was widely used by everybody, homeowners, farmers. Roundup, perfectly safe, dissolves in the ground, not a problem. Well, it turns out it doesn't do any of those things, and it's now a known carcinogenic. And there's even lawsuits filed against Monsanto because of all the damage Roundup's done to farmers and other people who heavily use it. But it all passed the tests, and the FDA approved it. So, the FDA, this is back in the Obama administration, and I hardly doubt anything changed under the Trump administration, said they don't have enough staff to adequately guarantee the safety of the food supply or to review all these chemicals that are introduced all the time. And we have no idea what all these chemicals do mixed up together. Anyway, this was a member of the Texas Pesticide Review Board as they were reviewing the chemical chlordane. He said, sure, it's going to kill a lot of people, but they may be dying of something else anyway, so let's approve it. That's the kind of strict oversight I want to see from a member of a committee like that. I can feel good sleeping at night knowing that's the thought process. Well, to quote the text, environmental concerns fall within the scope of sociology because humans have such a profound effect on the world, and the state of the natural environment depends primarily on how human beings organize social life. Let's put it another way. The planet was doing fine until we arrived on the scene. Not saying we shouldn't be here. I'm simply saying we are the ones who are primarily responsible for destroying natural processes that the environment would go through. Ecology is the interdisciplinary study of the interaction of living organisms and the natural environment. The natural environment is the Earth's surface and atmosphere, including various living organisms, as well as the air, water, soil, and other resources necessary to sustain life. Humans are part of and dependent upon the natural environment, but humans are unique as the only living species that can transform the world. Francis Bacon said, we cannot command nature except by obeying her. Well, on page 621 for the exam, you need to know about technology and the environmental deficit. The environmental deficit is a situation in which the negative long-term consequences of decisions about the natural environment outweigh whatever short-term focus on material affluence may occur. This term was first used and this concept, I should say, was first used by F. Herbert Borman in an article written in 1990 called The Global Environmental Deficit. So this concept contains three key ideas. Number one, the state of the environment is a social issue because it reflects human choices about living. Two, the concept suggests that environmental damage is often unintended. It's ignorance. By focusing on short-term benefits, we don't always see the long-term harm. Well, first of all, I find it hard to believe anymore. It's ignorance. Ignorance to me, again, is you don't know any better. Oh, we know better now. I saw the other day that off the Pacific coast, they found, I don't know how many, but countless 55-gallon drums of a chemical that was disposed there by a chemical company. So in other words, instead of finding a safe and approved way to dispose of it, they just dumped it in the ocean. Yeah. It's like, oh, because, it's a big ocean. It can absorb everything. So I find it hard to believe that was ignorance and it wasn't just intentional. But I suppose if you go back further in time, it was pure ignorance. People didn't know any better. Okay, so by focusing on short-term benefits, we don't always see the long-term gain. I'll give you a great example is coal manufacturing, coal mining, I should say. Coal has been on decline in the United States. President Trump said he was going to save coal miners' jobs, which proved to be an impossibility because coal is not cost effective for power plants to use compared to natural gas, and natural gas is cleaner. Okay, so by focusing, and then he tried to pass policies and tried to force the electric companies, the power companies, is using coal, which of course would have jacked up the price of electricity. And they're going, it doesn't make sense. Why would you want to do that? Again, it's short-sighted because what is the damage of the environment to burning coal? It puts mercury in the atmosphere. I mentioned in the previous presentation about the horrible conditions in Beijing. Why? Because largely coal is the fossil fuel of choice used throughout Beijing. So obviously we can't keep going that way. If you go back and look at a picture, I've seen them, pictures of St. Louis or Pittsburgh. This was in the 1950s, big heavy industrial manufacturing areas. On a sunny day, there were days in which you had to have your lights on in your car, all the street lights were on, you could barely see your hand in front of your face because there was that much pollution, right? So we've come a long way from all of that and certainly want to go back. Anyway, or another example would be, well, let's open up this area so we could do more logging. Okay, well, that's going to help the loggers in the short term, but what does it do long term to the environment by removing more trees that filter the atmosphere and take carbon dioxide out? Environmentalists use the term overshoot to refer to exceeding the carrying capacity of an environment intentionally or otherwise. Okay, so think about 7 million people live in New York City area. Where you gonna put the garbage? Because there's too many people in too small an area. So initially they would haul it to, and they still do, to Staten Island. There's a huge dump site there in Staten Island, but it could only hold so much. And so where did the rest go? Well, then they started dumping it in New Jersey, which of course created some tension between New Jersey and New York. And then in the last few decades, instead trucking in here to the United States, or into Pennsylvania, the garbage state. In some, but in all respects, the environmental deficit is reversible, which is point 3. To give you an example, I can remember in the 1970, Time magazine ran a headline article on the cover of it. It said, "The Great Lakes are dead," that we had so polluted the Great Lakes that they're actually dead. We brought them back. They're not pristine. It's sort of like I saw a stat the other day about the Chesapeake Bay. The Chesapeake Bay is currently about 65% of what it looked like. And this is an improvement, a dramatic improvement, 65% of what it must look like to the Native Americans when it was pristine. To give you an example of how bad things were in the Great Lakes, you know, a great story about Cleveland and how Cleveland was such a national joke. What I'm not saying deserved, I'm saying it was, is that flowing through it is the Cuyahoga River. Well, Cleveland was another one of these huge industrial cities that, you know, then became part of the Rust Belt when all that manufacturing left, steel manufacturing and other forms. Anyway, they would just dump things into the river. And at one point, the Cuyahoga River caught on fire. Now, it's kind of ironic because usually when the city catches on fire, everybody jumps in the river to save their lives. People had to run away from the river because the river was on fire. There was so much pollutants, I should say, in the river. They caught fire, oil pollutants. So no wonder the Great Lakes were dead because, see, the Cuyahoga feeds into the Great Lakes. The global dimension in studying the natural environment is for the same reasons the whole study of sociology must be global. It's all interrelated. The planet consists of a single ecosystem, the system composed of the interaction of all living organisms in their natural environment, where all living things and their natural environment are interrelated. It's a delicate balance of magnificent perfection, where changes have profound ripple effects throughout the ecosystem, changes we can't even imagine. So sometimes, for example, to eliminate a predator that was introduced into a society, we have to introduce another predator to get rid of that one in the environment. But then we don't know if we introduce that in predator, what the hell's going to happen with that? You know, so now before they do anything like that, for example, they're trying to develop genetically altered mosquito that when mosquitoes breed with it, they can't reproduce anymore. And the idea would be to eliminate mosquitoes because they, you know, what do they, dengue fever, malaria, geez, I'm blanking on the name of the disease here in the United States that we've seen some evidence of, all borne by mosquitoes. Okay, so if we get rid of all mosquitoes in the world, what happens? You know, are they a necessary part of the ecosystem, or we won't know until we eliminate them? That, whoops, maybe we shouldn't have done that. Okay. To give you an example of how the rainforest has declined, Costa Rica, which literally means rich coast, at one point was estimated to contain 1/10 of all living species on the planet. Think about that. Think about how environmentally rich it was. 10% of all the living species on the planet lived in this little country. Now only 1/10 of the Costa Rican tropical forest remains as the country has become a haven for wealthy expatriates. And throughout Central America, like Costa Rica being an example, what happened to the land was, and why they stripped the forest down is because they wanted to grow cattle instead. Why? Because fast food beef demand here in the United States. So when this became more and more evident, you would see places like McDonald's and Burger King all saying, no, we don't get our beef anymore from, you know, Central America because we don't want to be responsible for stripping the rainforest. Did you know, or even care to know, that a vegetarian diet is much less environmentally damaging than a meat-based diet? It takes 10 times more land to produce a pound of meat protein than vegetable protein. Also, methane gas production from feeder and dairy herds, also delicately known as bovine inflatulence, is believed to be a significant contributor to global warming and global stench. Cattle herds are responsible for topsoil erosion and for stripping vegetation. So the alternative. Now, having said that, you know, you don't have these massive cattle drives anymore like back in the old West, where the cows were grazing on the plains and they bring them in. It's come back to some extent, and why? Because of people's demand for pasture-fed, organically raised cows, and so, you know, that has come back to an extent, but not like it was in the old days of the West. So what do they do instead? Well, they create out in the Midwest giant herds of cattle that are all just in one place. Why are you going to feed them? Well, you just, bring out massive amounts of troughs of food and continue to feed them. But the problem is, um, when you have these giant feeder, how are you going to get water? Because in the past, when you had the herds spread out all over the Midwest and the West, they were drinking out of the streams and rivers and so forth. Well, now how are you going to feed? Well, of course, you have to bring up water from the underground water supply. Well, why is that an issue, you may ask, or not, if you're still awake? Well, because the giant Ogallala Aquifer, which lies below 7 straits from South Dakota down to Texas, that's how big this underground aquifer is estimated to be about 1/3 of its original size. That's it. So we're pumping the water out faster than it can be refreshed, partly because of this. I'm not saying that's the main. It's obviously people concentrate in those areas, but having these concentrations of cattle also contribute to it. Now, when you have all these cattle together under rather unnatural conditions, what else do you have to do? Well, you're going to prevent diseases from coming in. So what do? You have to inject them with antibiotics and so forth. Okay, so then what happens? Well, then we eat the meat, and as a result of eating the meat, we ingest the antibiotics, and that's one of the primary reasons why we become more and more immune to antibiotics over the years. That and the increased use of them and prescriptive use of them by us. But don't worry, I'm sure it's all under control. Currently, the United States uses twice the per person energy, per capita means per person, per capita energy that European societies do. We use twice the energy. We are only 5% of the world's population, but use 1/3 of the world's energy. Why? Because we're pigs. We're pigs. Remember the song, White Album, Beatles, Little Piggies? It's us. Okay, on page 621, culture, growth, and limits. First of all, you need to know about the logic of growth value. Based on the cultural emphasis of American values such as material comfort, progress, and science, remember those were all on the list of 10 you needed to memorize for the exam. The logic of growth is an optimistic view of the world, holding that because people have improved their lives through ever more productive technology, that will continue to do so into the future. It has historically been and continues to be a powerful and influential element of U.S. culture. Members of our society have always tended to treat growth and vigor as more or less synonymous with progress, and both the same as better. So bigger is better is what we've always been arguing. So even though it's recognized that natural resources are finite, we believe in our ability to always develop a technological fix to our problems. So for example, if we find that climate change is causing more and more arid conditions in growing areas, we can genetically modify the plants to become more water tolerant, as opposed to, not creating the conditions where we're running out of water. And who knows, is this going to work or not? So far, you can say, well, it has. I mean, there have been, I don't know if maybe there'll even be a technological fix for climate change. I know one of the technological fixes is build a wall, around New York City. We'll talk more about that in a moment, but meaning we can't stop it. So instead of stopping it or trying to stop it, we'll instead just build a wall around New York to protect it. But again, the argument here is growth for the sake of growth is just good in and of itself. John Nichols said, growth for the sake of growth is the ideology of the cancer cell. In contrast to this, on page 682 is the limits to growth philosophy. While Rachel, and these are like the new Malthusians. Remember we talked about Malthus, Thomas Malthus, the food supply increases arithmetically while the population increases geometrically, therefore we'll eventually run out of food. So these people are considered new Malthusians. While Rachel Carson's Silent Spring was one of the early spurs of the environmental movement, the 1972 book report, The Limits to Growth, largely set in motion the environmental movement. It was based on computer models. What happened was at the head of Ferrari, but it was an Italian industrialist who was concerned about what was happening to the world. And so at this time, we now had giant computers beginning in the 1972 and supercomputers, I should say, nothing like the ones today, but the beginnings of it. And so his concern was, and he actually paid to have major scientists in every field of human endeavor within their field plot out, like, what do you anticipate, mathematic from your field, plot out what's going to happen from that perspective to the world. And then he plugged all these different perspectives into the supercomputer, and the result was this book called The Limits to Growth. Some 3 million copies of the book have been published in 27 languages, and they've had updates published more recently. So the limits to growth thesis is that humanity must implement policies to control the growth of population, material production, and use of resources, or face catastrophic environmental collapse. The argument is that we must change our thinking regarding the cultural emphasis on the logic of growth. Current patterns are simply not sustainable for even another century, necessitating in us deliberate changes in how we live. So, in terms of the current political divide, conservatives would typically ally to the logic of growth, and liberals would adhere more to the limits to growth philosophy about the environment. So the real dilemma of growth is that we needed to provide for the population we have now, much less what it's going to be by 2050, but we can hardly afford the environmental degradation that it's going to cause and the strain that's going to cause. So we're kind of between a rock and a hard place here. If we industrialize, that advances the cause of women in poor nations of the world. It feeds more people, and it has. But with industrialization also comes impact on the environment. So can we afford to industrialize and address all these problems through the logic of growth, and still not do even more damage to the environment? Now, sometimes say, oh my gosh, another kid born in the poor nation of the world, this overpopulation is going to strain the world's resources. True. However, over a lifetime, a child born in the US will consume about 5 times the total resources that a child born in a poor nation of the world will consume. So once again, why? Because we're pigs. All right. Now you will see organizations that continue to monitor this process. Now, why? It's because it's absolutely necessary. So for example, if I said to you, how's the air? Do you think the air is less polluted than a year ago? Our senses can't detect it. Unless you're living in Beijing and it's covered with smog and you're hacking your lungs out, yeah, then you can tell. But we can't. Our bodies are not designed to measure or to determine or to sense these changes. So you have to have these scientific models to monitor what's going on in the environment to let us know what up. That's an environmental term too, what up. All right. Our emphasis on growth is good is exemplified by a typical news broadcast. Check it out. Don't go by me, which says, good news on the economic front. Housing starts were up 12% in June. Never will we hear economic growth characterized as bad. In response to this thinking in the 1970s, a book came out by E.F. Schumacher, and it was called Small is Beautiful, Economics as If People Mattered, Buddhist Economics. And he was trying to point out that we can achieve a sustainable society and not sacrifice growth by also working toward a sustainable society in terms of trying to control how our economy operates and be more careful about what we do economically in terms of its impact on the environment. Again, it's called Small is Beautiful, classic book. Okay, climate change. It used to be called global warming, but that had kind of, that term pissed some people off. So then we went, okay, well, it's climate change because it's more all encompassing. let me put it this way. We now have ready to rock. Uh, the most recent estimate I saw is we currently have 50 years of fossil fuel products ready to use. I mean, accessible, ready to go, 50 years. So we don't need to find any new oil site. We don't need to find anything new. We already have enough for 50 years. Now, I'm not saying that's enough, but it was interesting because Biden, and actually this goes back to Obama, trying to address climate change, saying we certainly can't continue to go the fossil fuel route because of all the damaging effects it has on the environment. And America's embracing it. You know, one of the fastest selling car segments are hybrid and electric cars. Now, having said that, you got to plug your car in somewhere, so the electricity's got to be produced somewhere, but producing it by gas-fired plants, natural gas-fired plants, is a lot less damaging to the environment than having all those same number of cars and or trucks on the highway spewing out pollution. Also, the plants themselves are one of the major contributors to global warming and also the pollution in terms of emissions. Okay, so getting back to that, what Obama argued and what Biden is arguing is we America need a master plan. We need a master plan whereby we move away eventually from fossil fuels. It ain't going to happen tomorrow. So the immediate reaction is, are you saying we shouldn't frack? Yeah, okay, we need fracking in the sense of it creates natural gas, and we need the natural gas because then we don't have to use the more intensive fossil fuels like oil, which are much more impactful on the negative impact on the environment. So we need a plan. So we'll need fossil fuels to get us to the post-fossil fuel era, but we need a master plan to accomplish that. There is none. Yeah, wouldn't it just seem logical that it behooves us, and I'm all about behooving, if it behooves us as the United States, and in fact the whole world, to come up with a plan, a master plan of how to get from where we are now to where we need to be so that we can try to reduce the impact of climate change. I'll repeat what I said previously. It's a great quote from Obama, and he said to the millennials, he said, you're the first population to experience climate change, and he said, you will be the last one who can do anything about it. Well, that extends to you guys too. This is the challenge of your lifetime. This is the great challenge for you. All other problems shrink to insignificance. Why? Just for an example, 1/3 of the world's population lives along the coastline. It's not a question of if the water starts rising, it's already rising. And people can debate all they want about, the deniers can debate, say, well, the evidence of that isn't fit. There are along the Atlantic coast, the Navy has actual devices that measure they're mechanical devices that measure the rise in the waters. And all along the Atlantic coast, they have been clearly indicating a rise in the water. In Miami, they're trying to effectively lift the whole city up by 10 feet. The head of the Pentagon warned the president when Obama was president that they're losing the Norfolk Naval Base, that when it rains now, as the waters continue to rise off the coast, that it's impassable to get back and forth between certain parts of the base. And he's saying, we got to do something about it. Why? Because that's one of the main places where our nuclear subs are housed and so forth. So it's happening, folks. It's happening. Even the Pentagon is warning the country about, we got to do something about it. We see it. And I've been noticing in intelligence reports about, forecasts for the future for America in terms of concerns is the impact climate change is going to have. In terms of it's going to cause geopolitical struggles, geopolitical wars. And so they're already warning about, in terms of the profound impacts about climate change. Can you imagine 1/3 of the world's population suddenly having to move inland or having to move inland as the waters continue to rise? And it's happening much faster than we ever thought and we ever projected. Every year we find more signs like, oh my God, it's happening even faster. So we got to do something about it. It is the problem, the crisis of our time. The water supply. Benjamin Franklin said, when the well is dry, then we know the worth of water. So what's happening is we're running out of it. Only 3% of the world's water, which is 3/5 of the globe being water, is drinkable. Ice caps contain 2%, 1% is in liquid form. Hence, water is more scarce than some think. Well, the way the ice caps are melting, we're going to have more water soon. It's just going to be seawater. Some people argue there'll be water wars. We're running out of water. Look at the Southwest, for example. More and more people keep flocking to Las Vegas and to Arizona to live. Where the hell are they going to get the water? There is one dam damming up the Colorado River. And as a result, the Colorado River barely runs into Mexico anymore, and it once did, because so much of it has to be put aside for the water, for the people to have water. Because you ain't going to drill a well and find water in the middle of Arizona. So it's a crisis, and yet more people keep moving there. Where are you going to get the water? Fortunately, we have Canada, which has an abundant water supply. Canada, who Homer Simpson refers to as America Junior. So, as long as we keep cozying up to the Canadians, maybe they will favor us with some water. Air pollution. Hey, it's gotten better, but with the relaxation of a lot of standards under the Trump administration, a ridiculous number of standards have changed, which allow the opportunity for more pollution into the atmosphere. Changes like reducing the regulations on what certain plants can emit and so forth in the way of their emissions from their production facilities. Okay, next topic for the exam on page 627, declining biodiversity. Much of this decline is associated with the decline of rainforests, which are home to almost half of Earth's living species. I mentioned Costa Rica before. Costa Rica leads the world's tropical countries in rate in which it's cutting down its forests, 7% per year. Brazil is cutting down the most forests, 3.2 million acres a year, 3.2 million acres a year. Throughout the world, 100 acres of rainforest disappear every minute, 100 acres every minute. Why should we care? This is the lungs of the planet. Rainforests are the lungs of the planet. And you can't replace a tree that's taken out and say, well, we'll just plant another one. Now, the tree that was in place is huge. It filters out much more of the atmosphere than this little tree. Will take 20, 30, 40 years for that tree to get to the height where it'll have the same impact, positive impact on the environment. So declining biodiversity, why should we be concerned? So you need to know the following. Number one, our planet's biodiversity provides a varied source of human food needed to feed our booming population. Genetic engineering techniques can take advantage of various plant aspects and combine them. Two, the Earth's biodiversity is a vital genetic resource regarding medical and pharmaceutical research. Well, the problem is almost every prescription drug is typically based on a plant. Not all, but originally they were. For example, aspirin is based on willow bark. So anyhow, a lot of or on fungi. Plant species are fungi. So anyway, the point being, as these plant species disappear, we're in a mad rush to find them. There are companies who are down there, pharmaceutical companies in the tropical forest, grabbing every plant they can and just bringing them back here so that they can study them before they're gone. Sometimes they'll work with the local shamans because the shamans will point out which herbs have historically had a certain known efficacy, like, oh, we take this herb to help us do this, help us do that. Because a lot of times when they've done research on these herbs, they figured out why they've been used for hundreds and hundreds of years, maybe even thousands of years, because they can see that what these shamans said the herb does, it in fact does do. Other groups are actually there's a cryogenic program. I think it's located in England, but don't quote me on that. But they're trying to get seeds from every plant in the world, and they just freeze them, because if the plant's gone, they can eventually reproduce the plant again. That's how dire the situation is, folks. 3, most importantly, with the loss of any species of life, the beauty and complexity of our natural environment are diminished. And 4, unlike pollution, the extinction of any species is irreversible and final. It raises questions of environmental ethics and whether we have the right to do so. Well, I actually teach a course in the environment, and just like how the environment is no longer a separate edition in this text, so no one takes the course anymore when I offer it. It's like, who cares about the environment? And it was how can I put this? This course comes under the heading of, see if you can put these letters together in the correct order, EZA. Every week we'd have student facilitated class discussions and videos. That was it. And still no one's taken the course, so we can talk about the state of the environment. What are the social issues associated with it? But one of the points we talk about is environmental ethics. And so I'm just going to give you 3 general approaches to this. One is, and of course, we always quote the sacred text. So in the Bible, there's a quote that says, a verse that says, and God and man, ye shall have dominion over the species. And so the understanding by some is that since we're the highest form of intelligence, this whole thing is for us to use and misuse. And so other species don't count because, after all, we're the top of the heap. Another is that, no. We have a caretaker responsibility. We're like the zookeepers. And so it's up to us to make sure we take good care of it because, after all, we have a vested interest in it too. Now, I want to go back to these 2 for a moment. So let's suppose you looked at and arranged it in a hierarchy and said, okay, what's the most simple form of life besides a college professor? Okay, say, okay, single cell plant. So you work your way up to the more complex animals. And as you work your way all the way up, what's at the top of the heap? Humans, okay? Now, so we claim because we have the highest form of consciousness and we're at the top of the heap, therefore we're in charge. Okay, but just for an example, as I mentioned earlier in this chapter, let's take humans out of the equation. Could the planet run well? Of course it could. It's us who changes things around. Okay, but let's go down further. Say, well, what about plankton? What if we got rid of plankton? Now it's way down in the bottom of the pyramid. What if we got rid of plankton? Do you realize everything above it would disappear? So maybe it's the single cell animals. Maybe it's plankton that's the most important thing, not us, because everything above it depends on everything below it. So if you take out any of the lower levels, it eliminates everything above those levels as well. I'll give you another example. Sometimes people argue that all species are equally important. And so, for example, I've been taunted, not so much anymore, but over the years from eating a vegetarian diet. Currently I eat a pesce-vegetarian diet, so I don't want to create any other illusions. But at one point I was eating only a vegan diet. Okay, long story short, some people would say to me, well, you're eating plants, you're killing plants. I go, dude, I'm not an air fern. I got to eat something. But if I eat 2 carrots, do you think they scream as loud as if I killed a cow? Whereas Tolstoy once said he was a vegetarian, and people came into his house and they saw lambs playing outside, and they said, oh, are we going to have lamb tonight? And he said, if you go out and kill it. So good question. Would you be willing to kill your own food? Some people would, some people wouldn't. So his argument was it's being hypocritical to say, well, I like to eat meat, but, I won't be willing to kill the animals myself. So his argument is if you can't kill it, you shouldn't eat it. Okay, the third view, which is the one I subscribe to, not unique to me, of course, is that we and the environment are one and the same. There is no separation. Separation is an illusion. That is one of the central tenets of mysticism. Separation is an illusion. There is no separation. Everything is one thing. And so we in the environment are one and the same. Everything we do to the environment we negatively affects us directly. All right. What we got here? Last thing from this chapter is on page 628, looking ahead toward a sustainable society and a sustainable world. An ecologically sustainable culture refers to a way of life that meets the needs of the present generation without threatening the environmental legacy of future generations. Lester Milbreth said, if there is no suitable habitat for other creatures, there is no suitable habitat for humans. There are three basic strategies. Number one, bring world population growth under control. The current 7 point what billion we have is already straining the environment. There are 84 million new people each year, 81 million of which are in poor societies. Let me put it another way. A city of 200,000 people appears on the planet every day. So I don't know what it currently is, but that's roughly the size of, say, San Francisco. So every day, another city of 230,000 appears on the planet. So if you factor in birth rate minus mortality, every day, 230,000 more people. Tomorrow, 230,000 more. Two, we have to conserve our finite resources. We need to have a more efficient use of, seek alternative resources, and even learn to live with less. Well, you know, we're already learning to live with less under the pandemic. But let me give you one example. Some years ago, and actually you've seen this with the horrific fires in California, is they have to have rolling blackouts or brownouts. Now, this is because the power lines themselves, they found were causing fires. So when the wind is really whipping, those Santa Ana winds come in, they can bring down the power lines or spark them, which causes fires. So they literally shut down the electricity. Now, this goes back even further, where there was once where California was straining to meet its demand for the power. And so there'd be what they call brownouts and blackouts. People would just lose their electricity. So in order to offset this, people had to reduce their electric consumption. So what did they do? Get this. They went out and replaced their incandescent bulbs with LEDs and immediately cut their electric costs by 10 to 20%. So yeah, I know they initially cost more of those bulbs, but in the long run, you cut your bill by 20%. That's how you live with less. Like, how hard is that to do? And yet, when the government tried to ban all incandescent bulbs except those for specialty items like, I don't know if you have a mirror with bulbs above it, you know, specialty, people fought like hell. You know, people said, my God, you have no right to tell me I can't buy an incandescent bulb. We can't afford you buying incandescent bulbs anymore. We need to just go to LEDs for the sake of the planet. You know, once again, my individual freedom demands I have an incandescent bulb. No, the collective needs of all of us demand that you don't. You don't need one. Use an LED. How hard is this? And you'll save money. Oh. Okay, there also has to be reducing waste is the third feature here, the third criterion here. Using less reduces waste as well as expand recycling programs worldwide, which will happen as you become commercially feasible in a market economy. Okay, so two aspects of this is one, of course, recycle. Two, you got to buy the recycled goods. If you don't, there's no market for recyclables. So for example, recycled aluminum foil, it ain't cheap, it's expensive. Recycled paper, some of it's the same quality, some of it's a little lesser quality, but unless you buy it, where's there going to be a demand for recycled paper? Like what recycler is going to take paper if nobody is buying the product from the recycled paper or recycled toilet paper, whatever? So these things we could do. One of the uh, areas of growth, for example, could be using hemp. Hemp was widely used and touted by George Washington in colonial days. It's an extremely strong fiber. Hemp could replace cotton. It's much more energy efficient than growing cotton. So we could use hemp for a lot of products, not the smokable type, but let alone for CBD purposes and so forth. But so we have to find some, cost-effective substitutes from what we're doing. Or plastics. Plastics, that giant lake of plastic or area of plastics that's in the Pacific Ocean. I think it's like the size of Texas. It's massive. It all congregates together. And they're seeing all over the beaches in Micronesia and the southeastern part of the southwestern part of the Pacific Ocean. They're seeing plastic wash up. Now, a lot of it comes from those countries in that region who don't do recycling at all, but more of it is coming from us too. Because what happens to our recycled plastics is we used to send them all to China. But so we literally take our plastics that are all crushed up, our recycled plastics, put them on a boat, send it to China, and China will use it. But China, again, trying to clean up its own environment, has become more particular about what level of plastic contamination will take. So a lot of it doesn't go there anymore. And a lot of what we think is getting recycled in the way of plastic is just getting buried in landfills because nobody will take it anymore. So, for recycling to work, you have to have the whole loop complete. You have to have a place to take the recycled products and an efficient use of those recycled products and people buying them. So, in general, we need to move from an egocentric view to an ecocentric view that leads us to see the present, how the present is tied to the future, and that we must all work together. And boy, is that not the trick. Fortunately, one of the things Biden wants to do is he wants to rejoin the Climate Paris Accord so that we, the world's nations, can try to work together to reduce global emissions because we got it. It's a global problem. Now, one of the reasons we dropped out of that, according to Trump, was it was costing Americans jobs. Not true at all. So there are approximately 30 to 35,000 coal mining jobs, but there are 600 to 700,000 jobs currently in turbine or wind power and solar. And no, they don't cause cancer, windmills. Anyway, so it doesn't cost jobs. Making this transition to an ecocentric economy actually creates jobs, folks, in the long run. And so it can become job intensive. So what I think we need to do, hardly unique thing, is instead of a consumer-based society, we need to switch our economy to instead being one that's based on ecological sustainability, which would create a whole bunch of different jobs. It may eliminate some, but that's the way progress is. Now, I'm not being cold hard about this. Like what I think we should be doing for the coal miners is we should be helping them to relocate and retrain because if they don't have the money to move, we'll help you to move and or train you for jobs available in your area for which you don't currently have those skills. So I don't just mean throw those people to the side, but it's the nature of progress that some jobs move on. I know we all feel bad for the blacksmiths in the 1900s, when the car came along, but, it all worked out. So that's what I suggest. Get away from consumer bait, which doesn't mean no consumer goods. It just means that that's not the focus of our economy. It's sustainability, ecological sustainability. Norman Cousins said, nothing would be more dangerous today to the human future than if the American standard of living were to be achieved in country after country in the world. And finally, I'll leave you with this. Rachel Carson, who did a little takeoff on Frost's famous poem, she said, we stand where two roads diverge, but unlike the roads in Robert Frost's poem, they are not equally fair. The road we have long been traveling is deceptively easy, a smooth superhighway in which we progress with great speed, but at its end lies disaster. The other fork in the road, the one less traveled by, offers our last and only chance to reach a destination that assures the preservation of the earth. That's it for this chapter. I'll see you soon for chapter 24. Study hard and hang in there and stay safe. Bye for now.